Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a weekly radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. every Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, we will be talking with Dahr Jamail, an internationally recognized climate author who says it is time to realize that we have not done our job and the worst of climate change is now inevitable. So our focus needs to shift to adaptation. We'll explore his thinking on this and what adaptation could look like at national, regional, state, local, and personal levels in just a moment. But first, a few reminders. Last week, we discussed the proposed Santa Lina development on Albuquerque's west side as it reaches yet another critical decision point on August 16th. I spoke with Maslin Locke, a staff attorney at the New Mexico Environmental Law Center, Norm Gaum, former director of the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission, and an active member of the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates, and Marcia Fernandez, a retired teacher, mother, grandmother, and community activist and farmer. All three are fiercely opposed to Santa Lina. This show was recorded before the Bernalillo County Commission hearing we discussed. So by the time you hear this show, the hearing will have occurred and Retake Our Democracy will have reported on it. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land. I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn much from their custodial caring for the land, water, and air. Retake is beginning to focus on the 2023 legislative session with Zoominar series, focusing on key issues we hope will become bills that we will support and initiatives we will oppose. We kicked off the series last month with a discussion focused on gun violence prevention with Miranda Viscoli, the co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence, and Janai Martinez, a student activist from Albuquerque. We discussed what might be possible in 2023 by way of meaningful gun violence prevention legislation and how you can help. Later in July, we discussed modernizing the legislature with Representatives Angelico Rubio from Las Cruces and Cristina Ortez from Taos. Activist Rika Bach was also on the panel. She's an activist with Indivisible Santa Fe, and Carol Lynch, the co-founder of Legislative Momentum. There is a strong movement among a group of 10 Democratic women state House members to reform the New Mexico state legislature with longer sessions, more paid staff, and paid legislators. We are the only state in the nation that doesn't pay our legislators. We learned why this reform is needed and how differently the legislature could function. You can view audio-video recordings of all of our Zoominars at retakeourdemocracy.org. Go to the actions and events in the homepage banner, click on that, and you'll land on a page that has a link to all the Zoominars. And that link is at the very top of the page. Don't miss our Zoominar coming up on September 13th on the Health Security Act, featuring a panel comprised of Mary Feldlow, who has been leading the health security effort for over 30 years. A representative of the medical profession will be on hand to speak about the immense administrative hurdles that are part of current medical practice. And legislative allies Day Hockman and Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino will also be on the panel. They're responsible for marshaling legislation through the legislature. Look for upcoming Zoominars this fall on public power, public banking, and hydrogen development. Go to retakeourdemocracy.org, actions and events in the homepage banner, where you'll find more info and links to register for these Zoominars. You must register to attend. Lastly, I want to remind you that if you're driving around and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show, and I'm suspicious that this show will run well over the 30 minutes, and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on Retake on the Radio button on the right side of the homepage. You'll find the YouTube recordings of all of our previous shows listed in chronological order, so you can binge watch the Zoominars and the radio shows for free. Okay, let's dive into our discussion about climate change and adaptation with Dahr Jamail. Hi, Dahr. I'd like to let our guests introduce themselves. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in climate journalism.
Yeah, hi, Paul. Well, I got involved in climate journalism because of what I was seeing when I lived in Alaska and was spending a lot of time in the mountains back in the 1990s. And at that point up there, especially being so close to the Arctic, it was very, very clear that dramatic changes were afoot and had been so for quite some time. So that was always in the back of my mind. And then I became a war journalist during the Iraq War and spent a lot of time covering that, nearly a decade. And then after that, shifted into environmental and climate journalism. And then that culminated with writing my book, The End of Ice, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption, which came out in 2019.
Mhm. Great book, by the way. When we spoke last, you described how the climate ship has sailed, and there are just too many irreversible processes in motion that will more than tip the scales and move us well past the Paris Accord goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Can you set the stage for today's discussion by outlining what those processes are and what that means for Earth and its inhabitants?
Sure. Just a couple of broad brushstrokes, because I think, especially given your audience, I think most people are probably pretty well acquainted with a lot of the specifics. But and I would send people to The End of Ice to read if they want to know a lot more, have those unpacked as far as impact on trees around the world, coral reefs, oceans, glaciers, etc. But I think two main things I'd point to right now are the fact that 93% of all the warming humans have generated in the atmosphere has actually been absorbed into the oceans. And so there's no way to get that heat out of the oceans. That's for starters. And if you look at the marine heat waves that have been sweeping the oceans and what that means to us, to other species as well as to us, that's intensely alarming. Plus the fact with that much heat already absorbed into the water, what that means for warming in Antarctica and of the tidewater glaciers across Greenland. And we're already seeing this massive effect, to the point where literally major ocean currents are being changed. And then, so all these different cycles that are in motion that are then affecting other cycles in these runaway feedback loops. The other thing I would cite as far as why I think we need to be very sober at looking at how far along we are is being realistic about the political change that would have to happen to actually stop generating CO2 emissions. And the bottom line with that is when the fossil fuel industries around the world, not just in the US, are making so much money off of the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, until they stop making that money, they're not going to stop doing what they're doing. So even the new so-called climate legislation that was passed in the United States, if you look at the concessions made to the fossil fuel industry, look at the Center for Biological Diversity's response to this legislation, you get sober real quick about how this idea of making the significant reductions necessary to generate some mitigation is really a pipe dream. And so I think, before we can really decide how we're going to behave during this point in history, we have to have a very clear understanding of where we are. And I don't think at all I take a pessimistic look at all about what's happening in the climate processes and how we're already off the cliff. It's not a pessimistic view, it's a realistic and an honest view.
Right. Yeah, and I've heard people say that, with Dahr Jamail, he's pretty dark view on climate. And they go, well, maybe if you're looking at what's going on, you have to have a dark view. I mean, otherwise you're not looking at what's going on.
Well,
Uh,
it's called reality. And,
Right,
one
right.
thing, especially in the book I recently co-authored, where we interviewed 20 different indigenous people, I learned so much working on this book. And one thing I learned that applies to what we're talking about right here is in many indigenous languages, there's not even a word for hope. And so, I have run, especially during my climate work, of, why don't you have hope, or can't we have some hope? And, frankly, I think that's a childish perspective, because we have to have a very clear vision of what's happening before then we can decide not just what to do, but how are we going to comport ourselves? How are we going to act?
So, I'm just starting to read The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, and talking with you before we got started. I know you're not a big fan of his writing. It's pretty interesting. It definitely shows the consequences of, because it's a futuristic kind of thing, not a century from now, but maybe 20 years from now, 15 years from now. And it shows the floundering of the international community trying to come to grips with climate change, much like they are now. I mean, it's nothing new. Like you said, it's the gas and oil industry has a pretty good stranglehold on policy internationally, and in that context, like you said, nothing changes. But what seems to be part of this book is that they're going to try all kinds of technological fixes to try and overcome climate change. And while I haven't gotten to the end of the book, it seems pretty clear that they're doing some pretty crazy Hail Marys halfway through the book. What is your view on technology as a means of helping to extricate us from where we are?
Well, this is one reason I'm not a particular fan of this work, is that the whole there's two reasons. One, the whole techno fix idea, that there is any sort of techno fix, is just really a continuation of this bifurcation that so many Western writers and journalists have, that we're somehow separate from the earth and can kind of act apart from it, and uh, somehow make decisions that are going to affect it without affecting ourselves. I need to pause for a second, Paul.
Okay, we're going to pause here for a second. So we were interrupted for a second. Can you try and pick up the thread there, Dahr?
Right. So in short, Paul, I just, anything that is really kind of promoting this almost us versus them perspective of, here's the earth and here's us. And therefore, if we do this, we can manipulate the earth to do this. I mean, it's really, how is that not just a continuation of the thinking that got us to this problem in the first place?
Exactly.
And so, it's a separation from, or a separation of, and plus, overlooking the fact that simply there's no technology that exists today or in the near or midterm future that could cause a substantial enough impact of CO2 reduction to actually cause mitigation effects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Plus, we will have learned nothing if we're able to pull a rabbit out of a hat. Then we're going to just destroy the earth some other way, because we think we can control it. So enough about someone else's book. Tell us about how you came to write The End of Ice, and let our listeners know a little bit about what you wrote in that book.
Yeah, the book was really, it's a big overview of different aspects of the climate crisis, of how it's affecting coral reefs around the world, the Amazon rainforest, glaciers, trees, etc. But I wrote it in a way that I wanted to really bring people into those areas, and try to impart the emotional aspect of what it's like to see these places that are being so dramatically impacted, especially for people who can't go there or have never been able to go there. And so what I did was I went into the field in all these areas with scientists who had long-term relationships with these areas. On average, folks that had been studying a particular area for 25 years, sometimes much longer than that. Or in the case of Thomas Lovejoy in the Amazon, someone who'd been studying it for longer than I've been alive. And so it really was an attempt to bring their feelings and their emotions into it, and what they were seeing and how that was affecting them, and try to bring the reader into that. And I did the best job I could of doing that. And the book really shows how far along we are. And in so many of these areas, essentially, we're looking at them in their final stages, like the Great Barrier Reef, for example, where leading coral reef biologists in Australia are saying, look, it's in its terminal stage. And so what it really feels like to go see these areas that, when I was born were in magnificent states and these wonders of nature. And then now, as I'm getting older, to have a chance to go see this area and know that it's probably the last time I'll get to see it while I'm alive, and what that feels like. And so the
Mhm.
book was really an attempt to kind of not just give people the information they need to know about how far along we are in the climate crisis, but um, really to kind of offer at least my experience of reconnecting to the earth, even at this stage of the game, and how important that is to do. And so the book kind of set the stage, in a sense, for setting me up for, look, I'm going to need some kind of new way to be with this information. And that's why my work took a little bit different direction after I finished that book, because I had to, for my own psychological and emotional well-being.
Mhm. Mhm. I can understand that. We got to take a short break here, Dar, to let our listeners know that we're listening to KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station. And it's in these days of misinformation that KSFR is so important, so much more important. They deliver straight news, no misinformation there on the local, state, and national news, as well as great cultural programming, music, and interview shows like Retake Our Democracy. And so, if you are someone who enjoys KSFR, after you finish listening to this show, I'd encourage you to go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button, and toss them 10, 20, or $50 and look at it as your ticket to it for admission to a whole range of great programming. They really deserve your support. It's a great resource to our community. So let's go on to our next little topic here, Dar. You have a new book that you published earlier this year. We Are the Middle of Forever. And as you noted, it's a series of conversations with 20 Indigenous Americans on climate crisis and the future of the Earth. First, what an honor to have been able to do that. And what a worthwhile project. You mentioned that you had to go in this direction to kind of develop a framework that you could live with, knowing what you knew about from the end of ice. I just obtained the copy yesterday and was able to scan it a little bit. And in the preface, you note that while the disruptions and displacements we are seeing as a result of climate inaction are shocking to most of us, it is nothing new to Indigenous people. It has been their history for many generations. And given this, these Indigenous leaders must have offered sage views on our situation. Can you share some of your more interesting perspectives gleaned from the interviews?
Sure. I'll start with mentioning that the book was co-edited by myself and Stan Rushworth, and he taught in a Native American lit and critical thinking for 30 years, and has been basically living his whole life in that perspective. And he had come to a couple of my climate talks from the end of ice, and we were watching in these talks the despair amongst the crowds, and really a lot of people kind of just hitting this point of like, well, what's the point? And we realized, okay, what could we do that would help? And uh, it was clear, like, well, Indigenous people who've already been through all of this. And that might sound like an odd thing for people to hear, but if you think about how, for example, if you take the Chiricahua Apache and have they were forcibly relocated from southern New Mexico and Arizona to Florida, well, that's abrupt climate change. To grossly understate that, and how did they survive that? And then these examples, there's hundreds of these examples across the country when it came to the settler colonialism and the genocide against the indigenous people, and how did they survive this, these worst case scenarios, seeing like in California, for example, a 90% reduction of their population inside of 25 years, and they're still here. So not only are they still here, but now, at least on the left, so many people are turning to them for leadership during this time of crisis. So maybe we should be listening to what they have to say. And so that was the inspiration of the book. And what it comes down to, if, I mean, there's so many points. It's, we would need hours to really give the book a fair shake and talk about some of the wisdom in it. It's a really, really important book, and I'll say flat out, it's the most important piece of writing I've ever been a part of, because it's changed my life working on it, because it really has shifted my perspective at the end of ice of having sharing in that despair of our situation to what's really important is, how am I going to comport myself during this time? Is, we may be looking at all these worst case scenarios of everything, not just the climate, but politically, economically, et cetera. But what's really important is, how can I continue to serve? How can I continue to help other species and future generations of my own species? Is what is my place in that, and what am I going to do? Because that's consistently the focus of the people in the book that we interviewed. For example, one woman, Karina Gould, in the Bay Area, who was gifted, her and some of her people were gifted basically a half acre in downtown Oakland of their own, their tribe's ancestral land. And so over the years, they've worked to rehabilitate and regenerate this land and do ceremony there, and species are coming back, and water's flowing again through a stream. And I played devil's advocate and asked her when we were interviewing her, I said, well, so what would you say to people who say, well, this is a half acre and what you're doing is great, but what about the globe? Look at the scope of the disaster. And she just said, look, I can't control all of that anyway. So why should I worry about that? What I'm doing is what I can do. And I think that's a really functional perspective. And I think, given especially the political situation in this country, I think it's a realistic perspective.
Mhm.
And it might sound almost like a cop out to some folks, but I think if you consider how many people are already doing this, then you start to get a little perspective. And I see that happening around where I live, not just with Indigenous people, but other people doing what they can. And there's a tremendous amount of that happening. And that was one perspective from the book that I found very helpful. And in some, I think it's a book that is contained with enough wisdom, experience, and knowledge that after people read it, the feedback that Stan and I are getting about the book is it has a very calming effect, and it provides a very, very deep ballast for people amidst these increasingly stormy times. And that's what we wanted to do, is to try to put something out there that would bring some calm and kind of a measured perspective about what's happening. And we feel like this book provides that.
I can't wait to get started. Um, our mutual friend Marielle was here last night for dinner, and she asked me to ask you one question. In this crazy, crazy world, you sort of answered it, but I have to ask it or she'll kill me. In this crazy, crazy world, from what do you derive meaning?
I think it's essentially in taking meaningful action. Um, for example, I just a couple days ago got back from a trip where I was able to take, with two other people, a 16-year-old niece into the backcountry over in the Cascade Mountains in central northern Washington, and watching her really connect in a deep way, in knowing, after including some conversations on the tail end of that trip, that this was something that's changing her perspective and will change her life forever, and this person of a future generation. And so that has deep, deep meaning for me. Doing something like that has far more meaning than writing an article or even a book. That this is something that's going to literally change a person's life, and then being there and being able to provide that for her going forward. And she's from Texas, and thanked me two different times on the trip for getting her out of Texas, even just for a week. And so I think it's that kind of deeper, meaningful action, with tangible results, and the rare action that someone can take these days and actually see an immediate tangible result, is that's how I know I'm on the right track and doing good work, if I can see how it's positively impacting somebody that I care about. So that, as well as being, excuse me, uh, trying to conduct good stewardship on the land where I live that supports me by taking care of the land, growing food, and trying to be a responsible steward, and basically putting into practice much of what I learned from working on this book.
Okay. So, this is sort of related. When we last spoke, you said that the wise path, given where we are now, is to focus on adaptation. That sounds a little like giving up. How is adaptation different from other forms of climate activism, and how is it not giving up?
Mm. Well, as far as another thing that really has come to me working on this book with Stan is, most of my life I've taken actions trying to get a specific result. And I think that's what activism is. Like, if we organize and we put enough pressure, we can try to get this change, right? So that has been a recipe for chronic disappointment and becoming dispirited over time, especially in this country now. And I've lived through that. I mean, all my work with the Iraq War and the BP oil spill, and ultimately didn't cause any kind of change in any policy whatsoever. But what came to me working on this book in a deeper way is doing things simply because they're the right thing to do, and not having any attachment to the result whatsoever, because I can't control that anyway. No matter how good I take the action, how good the action might be, the result's always going to be out of my control. But really letting go absolutely of that, and that's to me an honest adaptation to the situation that we're in, because knowing where we are in the climate crisis, and how today is better than tomorrow, and things are only going to continue to intensify no matter what is done. I have to find a way psychologically where I can continue to operate and be of service, and not become just completely depressed and give up, but find that deeper, meaningful action because it's the right thing to do, and not being attached to any result whatsoever. So if I'm in that mindset, then I'm going to just be finding different ways to be of service consistently, and that's never going to be contingent upon the results of that service. So therefore, I'm going to become less dispirited and less depressed, and that has been the effect.
Okay. So I want to try and put some meat on this, so to speak, and get us a picture of what adaptation actually looks like. What would it look like on an international, national, state, local, or personal scale? Or is this really just a personal adaptation?
Well, I can only speak to my own personal experience on that. I have no idea what it would look like on a national or international scale, other than to say I know a whole bunch of people doing it on a very, very personal scale across this country and other parts of the world with a lot of success. And for me, it means becoming much more deeply embedded in my immediate community and having kinship with these people, and growing much of my own food, and taking care of the land that takes care of me, whether I have the paperwork to that land or not, but basically being a responsible steward of the land wherever I live. And for me, it keeps me that much more connected to the earth, which is where everything begins and ends for me. If I'm not having that connection on a daily basis, then it's pretty easy to get kind of spun out with the bigger things that are happening in the world. And that certainly has been my experience, that I consistently daily, I have certain responsibilities on the land where I live and the people that I share it with. And in doing that, it's really changed my perspective on things, and made it a lot easier to get through these times in a deeper, more meaningful way. And I know a lot of people doing this with positive effect. And so in doing that, also I find that the deeper I get into community, and this kind of addresses staying out of the insanity that's happening across society. and also it's helpful economically, is that you need less money. The deeper into community I get of volunteering on a farm, meeting people there, when certain things come up, it means working with other people, not running out and buying something, or being taught and learning how to do things myself. And so
Mhm.
in all of that, just it's kind of a positive reinforcing feedback loop. The more I do that, the deeper into it I become, and then the more of service I'm able to be to others
So,
as well. So it really kind of counteracts some of the negativity out there.
so I take it that would mean that you are also then not eating meat or flying or limiting your driving and things like that. Are those personal decisions part of that?
Oh, absolutely. It's affected. I mean, I still eat meat, but I'm growing most of what I eat. So and I certainly drive less, and things like this. All of that is tied into it. And so the sum total of all of that is, uh, anyone trying to live this way, you become that much more healthy, it becomes that much more sustainable. And then PS, it's how we should have ideally in Western society been trying to live closer to the earth anyway. And folks in your generation knew this and started to try to practice this back in the 60s and 70s, but then we got very, very far away from that.
Right,
and
right.
and I think
Well, we're
part of
gonna
the
have to,
adaptation is looking at the landscape and saying, hey, what makes sense as systems break down? Well, we better get pretty good at living close with the earth again.
okay, we're gonna have to stop here and stop quickly because we're a minute or two, almost 2 minutes over the show. I was so interested in what you were saying, I lost track. But anyway, we're gonna take a minute break here and then we'll be back and we'll be doing the YouTube and we've got a lot more to talk about. So stay tuned. Okay, we're back with Dahr Jamail, and he was just talking about how well, you know what he was just talking about because the break was only like 5 seconds. Um, but he was saying that he continues to eat meat and he just drives less. But the meat that he I guess you ranch, is that part of?
Oh, well, being deep in community, for example, I have a friend who fishes and up in Alaska, and then he comes back and basically has a fishing co-op, and those of us who pitch in can get our fish that way. So that's what I mean. It basically means uh, buying less and less in stores and more and more from within your own community.
I
But
got
as
it.
far as fruit and vegetables and chickens and eggs and things like that, yeah, we have most of that going on right here.
Okay, okay, that sounds ideal. You've been careful to not characterize yourself as an activist, but as a journalist. What do you see as the most important role for journalists reporting on climate and international political negotiations? And do you track closely the machinations of the IPCC, et cetera, and their cascading reports?
Uh, I I don't, starting with the last question there. I don't track the IPCC closely anymore. I mean, given that their worst case projections have not kept a pace with reality since the 1990s. So it's kind of like, are you going to continue to follow a particular weather person when their reports are consistently grossly inaccurate? So
Mhm.
I don't really follow their work real closely. And as far as journalism, I don't. I actually, after the end of ICE, that was kind of my swan song. And after that, I decided to hang that up and uh, just work on this book with Stan. And I consider myself a recovering journalist at this point. But I think if I was still working as a journalist, the imperative of being, truthful and honest and, really looking beyond the myth of objectivity and just being very, very honest with people in writing, and certainly fair, but being very honest in assessments and not trying to sugarcoat that or water that down was always really one of my goals when I was a working journalist.
So we're going to go on to another journalist, Naomi Klein. My understanding of the climate crisis and the kinds of strategies that could meaningfully respond to the planet's warming comes from Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything. Sadly, this, or the climate crisis, didn't change much. Her aspiration was for an international recognition of how capitalism and the global North's capitalist colonization of the global South is a root cause of our climate problem, and that the only way to address climate was to first address capitalism's insatiable goal of unlimited growth and extraction of maximum profit. Climate be damned. Do you find truth to that perspective? And if so, what would be required to create the necessary political, economic, and cultural transformation Klein was calling for?
Well, see, there's being an activist and trying to work for a specific result, and how has that worked out? As you said, it hasn't. Things have only gotten dramatically worse since then. Just like when I was reporting from Iraq in 2003, 2004, things got only kept getting dramatically worse. Or the results of the BP oil disaster that I reported on heavily. Things have only gotten worse. No policies have effectively changed. Just more deep sea drilling and deeper waters, et cetera. And so it comes down to, again, I think, finding a specific thing that I feel deeply moved to engage in as an act of service, and doing that no matter the results. It's good to have books out there that can inform people's thinking, and certainly we need accurate information. But I think when I look out at the global crises, whether it's climate, war, economics, et cetera, who doesn't get completely, utterly overwhelmed by it? And so thinking that I can engage in an immediate activity that's going to change something internationally is really, I think, encompassing the same kind of hubris is that which have caused the thinking that has caused these problems in the first place. And I've been guilty of that in the past, for sure. And I've had to abandon that, and in reality, it comes back down into community and kinship. Is I can do what I can, and then I have to rely on and have faith that there's still plenty of other people out there doing the same thing. That it's not about changing the dominant system, which, again, if we look soberly at that as we do the climate crisis, like I said, until corporate powers aren't making billions of dollars a year to just do things that cause destruction in the planet, they're not going to stop doing it. And just because me or one other activist tries to work against them, it's just not going to stop it. And so I have to find what I can do personally that does bring meaning and to me personally, and take full responsibility for that. And that means being fully responsible to the other people within my immediate community. And then that really starts to change my perspective on what's happening on a broader scale.
So earlier you had said that many indigenous peoples don't even have a word for hope. Is some of your perspective and your adaptation sort of letting go of hope, or is it redefining hope in a new way?
I wrote about this at the end of my previous book, The End of Ice, that uh, hope is kind of an abdication of responsibility, and again, if I'm having hope, then that means I'm not really focused on what I'm doing. I'm focusing on what I think the results of that thing should be, right? Oh, I hope it's going to be okay. No, I need to just take care of what's in front of me right now. And so in that sense, I think hope, certainly by some of the indigenous folks that we interviewed in the book, it's kind of looked upon as a bit of a childish attribute, that something a child would do, whereas an adult taking full responsibility for their actions mean all I can do is what I can do, and how it turns out is how it turns out. It's none of my business, and besides, I don't have any control over that anyway. So in that ontology, there really is no place for hope, and there's no need for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm out of questions, and I was going to ask you a little bit more about the ministry for the future, but I know you're not a big fan, and neither am I. I find it an interesting book, but it's ultimately it's the hubris on spades, or on steroids, if you will, with we're going to fix this. All kinds of people out there fixing things, and I think what I'm hearing from you is you need to fix your garden and your food and your relationships with the people in your circle, and that's the job at hand. And let the powers that be the powers that be. Well, I want to
Well
thank you for
said.
the well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you again, Dahr. The radio show is just a vehicle for seeing you again, and it's great doing that. Is there any chance of your being out here in New Mexico anytime soon?
No plans. I'm really not traveling hardly at all anymore. So, but I'll certainly let you know if I make a road trip out there, Paul. And it's always good to talk with you. And I miss you, and certainly miss you and my other friends there in Santa Fe.
Wow. It's good to talk with you, and I'm sure they'll be listening. Marielle and Jeff were here last night. So thanks for being with me, and we'll get together again soon.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, bye-bye.